You are listening to Over and Back's Basketball Mysteries of the 1970s. Today's mystery is, how bad did it get for the NBA, really? Okay, we are back. I am Jason. With me, as usual, is Rich. And
hello.
We are talking about, we've all heard that the NBA really struggled in the late 70s and early 80s with financial issues, drug addiction gone rampant, overall bad image, struggling TV ratings, perception of aloof players. Is it really as bad as people say, or is it just somewhat exaggerated to kind of make a better story out of the eventual restoral of the NBA under Magic and Bird? That's something I've always kind of wondered about a little bit. It's sort of a convenient story for things to get this bad and then for Magic and Bird to lead the comeback. And, and what's the truth there?
Yeah, I guess an interesting question to ask, and maybe we'll get to the bottom of that a little bit too, is was it ever really great, or did Magic and Bird make it great, but the 70s were just kind of like you know what I mean? Because there's always that idea too. It's well, was it really that? Yes, the Celtics were great, and there was some, but maybe not. Maybe in the 50s and 60s it wasn't all that peachy, and maybe the 70s is just kind of neutral from those, and it really was the 80s that exploded the NBA on a big scene. But did it get bad or worse in the 70s, or was it just kind of the same? It's an interesting question for sure.
Yeah, and Breaks the Game really perpetuates that idea of this game really was there was this great healthy small league with these really good rivalries and these good stars and a good TV product in the I guess the mid to late 60s, and then expansion kind of tore everything apart, and it started making guaranteed contracts and all that. We went through that in a Breaks of the Game podcast, but I think that kind of creates that myth a little bit. So looking at the reality, I think it's a mixed. I think you can kind of make the case, but I think there's some things that complicate that case as well.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
So looking at the attendance and TV ratings, and there's some great numbers on the attendance from the Compendium of Professional Basketball by Robert Bradley, which I recommend to anyone who's a serious NBA fan interested. If you're interested in our podcast, you'll be interested in that. So from 77 through 80, roughly attendance stayed roughly steady, somewhere in the $9.8 to $9.9 million range. It went down a little bit in 78 for the first time. It was the first decline in attendance since 1950. It's 20 years. Then it stayed relatively steady through 80. Then 81, there was a fairly significant dip from 9.93 million to 9.44 million, and almost 1,000 fewer per game. That includes 81 was an expansion year with the Mavericks, so that's a really big dip even with the extra team. Then it goes up a little bit in 80 and then down a little bit in 83, but it's still staying at similar levels. And then 84 is really when the turnaround begins. And, from 84 to 87, it goes from 10 to 10.5 million to 11.2 to 12 million. By 87, there's an average crowd of 12,795 per game. So clearly at that point, that's really when the attendance turnaround begins. And it does make some sense that, Bird and Magic are now very established in the league. 84 is when the Celtics-Lakers finals happens. But it does take a while into the 80s for that really to begin. It certainly didn't happen right away with Bird and Magic.
Absolutely, yeah, and there's other superstars that are kind of emerging a little bit as well. Of course, you have that vaunted 84 draft class that comes in with Hakeem Olajuwon and Michael Jordan and those sort of guys too. So I do wonder if that was they needed the auxiliary guys to kind of come in and push it a little bit over the edge, where you have your dominant superstars, you have those two guys, those two teams, but then you get this influx of one of the best drafts of all time, and this influx of other new rising superstars too that maybe then pushes it up another level too. And it's also other markets getting a lot more. I mean, especially Chicago getting Michael Jordan, that was a market that was all but dead in a major, media market. They start kind of rising like a phoenix, so they kind of come up. And then, Houston as well, who wasn't a slouch either, that, had kind of been a sort of waiting in the wings for a while. And then Hakeem comes in and all that stuff kind of comes in, and they start becoming kind of a powerhouse as well. So maybe it was kind of the distribution. Also Patrick Ewing, I mean, you can't deny that as well. Patrick Ewing coming in, going to the Knicks, another major, huge media market as well, and becoming kind of a budding superstar there. So I think it's a little bit of both of those factors.
Yeah, I would agree. So looking at the TV ratings, starting in 76, there was a 11.5 rating and a 29 share. 77 actually goes up to a 12.7 rating. 78 and 79 are down quite a bit. 78 is 9.9, 79 is 7.2. Those are both the Bullets and Sonics finals. 1980 with the Sixers and Lakers goes up to 8.0, but that's still down from 78. 81 with the Rockets and Celtics dips down a bunch to 6.7. That's the low mark. And this is, by the way, the average rating for finals games for those series. 82, pretty big jump to 13.0. That is the second Sixers Lakers series. And now we're past the point in which the games are being tape delayed, and the tape delay was not necessarily a national thing, but it was tape delayed in lots of parts of the country and then shown live in the local markets. And then 83 is actually, it makes sense that 83 would be down from 82 because it was only a 4-game series. So it's down from 13.0 to 12.3. So not a significant dip. And then interestingly enough, 84, which is the Celtics Lakers, is down a little bit to 12.1. You would think that one would have been way up because of the interest in Bird versus Magic. But at least in terms of the finals TV ratings, that was not the case. It was down very slightly. And then 85, which is the Celtics Lakers rematch, is up to 13.5. And 86 and 87 are big jumps, 14.1 and 16.7, 87. And then throughout the 80s and early 90s, you're getting, really strong ratings for the most part, particularly when you have Lakers and Bulls in the finals.
Absolutely. And one of the other factors as well of the 70s is the drugs. Of course, it's a huge issue. A series of NBA players during the late 70s, early 80s got in illegal trouble, had to enter rehab because of drug issues. As noted, the NBA is hardly alone in this. The MLB had their issues as well, and every professional sports league kind of dealt with this as well. But in a league with, predominantly black athletes and black players playing in the league, it tended to get a little bit of a greater reputation for that damage. And there's possibly also the aspect too that because, and it happens with a lot of stuff with Allen Iverson, a guy who, in the hall, just joined the Hall of Fame this past year. He's a guy that I always mention where the fact that you could see his face and see his tattoos and see his emotions or whatever, people tend to get more kind of hot takey about, how they react and their emotions and how they're on the court. I do wonder as well if that plays a part in it, where there's probably guys, hopped up on cocaine playing the NFL, but they're wearing a helmet and pads and God only knows, whereas a lot of times there are, you'll see stories as well where they'll talk about NBA players and it's like, well, he's obviously on drugs, like look at him and you can tell, you can see his eyes, you can see his face, you can see how he reacts, you can see you're up close. So I do wonder if that plays a part a little bit in it as well. But one thing you will notice throughout this, and I guess I'm going to mention a bunch of players here that got in trouble with drugs and got suspended by the NBA and all that sort of stuff. One thing you'll notice is a lot of it happens in the 80s. A lot of suspensions happen in the 80s. A lot of their problems, though, started in the 70s. And I think it's not necessarily fair to say, oh, well, it wasn't a problem in the 70s because, look, all these things happened in the 80s. Because really the NBA in 1983, we'll talk about that, really kind of said, okay, we need to figure this thing out, and started really putting down harsh penalties, really suspending guys, really trying to get behind it as well. So the 70s, while there isn't as much punishment in the 70s, it is well known as an era where guys were, in many cases, especially cocaine being one of the primary ones, guys were just doing it a lot, during games, after games, before games, stuff like that. But yeah, you will see that a lot of these ones that we're going to mention are suspensions that happened in the 80s. But here's a few guys. Spencer Haywood, he was famously suspended by the Lakers during the 1980 finals. It got so bad for Spencer, as I mentioned, they suspended him during the finals. They could have used him too, as a few days later, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar would go down with an ankle sprain that would force Kareem to miss the deciding Game 6 in the NBA Finals, but the Lakers were without Spencer Haywood because he had so many issues. And Spencer did not take this too well. He actually formulated a revenge plan that would end in Paul Westhead's murder. This is true. In a 1988 interview, he said he wanted to possibly cut Westhead's car brakes. And then he went into great detail discussing flying out a genuine certified gangster. That's a quote, by the way, genuine certified gangster from Detroit, along with his associate, to formulate a plan to murder Paul Westhead. So not the greatest thing there. Bernard King, during his debut season, 1977, he was arrested on charges of possession of marijuana, prowling, and resisting arrest. He receives a 60-day suspension and paid a fine of $100. Just 1 year later, later, he was arrested again on cocaine possession charge while driving. A routine search also uncovered a small amount of cocaine in an envelope found in his pocket. And then he was also charged with reckless driving and driving without a license after that as well.
And also with Bernard King, there's a 1980 arrest when he's in Utah where he has more serious drug charges and also like a sexual assault charge that was and sodomy that were later. I think he pleaded guilty to lesser charges in that situation. So he had like 3 or 4 runs with the law and major drug issues before he went eventually did pretty well with the Warriors and then went to the Knicks and obviously was successful there.
Absolutely. Fast Eddie Johnson is our next guy, which is when your name's Fast Eddie, it's probably not very good. You're probably going to be a bit like, you're probably going to get into trouble. And
this is the Hawks Eddie Johnson, not the Suns Eddie Johnson, who was later in the is a broadcaster now. So that's an important distinction.
I think there was another. I was reading some articles too, and they used because there was an Eddie Johnson that played in the '90s, correct?
Yeah, that's the Suns, Eddie Johnson. Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the problem though is when this Fast Eddie Johnson was getting in like legal trouble, they would show the Suns Eddie Johnson in like news broadcasts because they would just type like Eddie Johnson NBA and then like their image search or whatever, and that one would come up and they're like, he's been arrested, he's done it. It's like, oh wait, hold on, like I haven't. But this Eddie Johnson, Fast Eddie Johnson, battled cocaine addiction for many years. After several suspensions, he finally checked himself into rehab in 1986. After he failed to follow through on mandatory counseling, the NBA banned him for life in 1987. Johnson battled cocaine addictions again, throughout his year. 2008 rather, Fast Eddie Johnson was convicted of sexual battery of a minor under 12 and lewd and lascivious molestation of a child under 12. The counts carried a mandatory life sentence without parole, and he is currently incarcerated at Santa Rosa Correctional Institute. So another guy that just drugs in a large part derailed his career and had a good little run going for a little while. Played for the Hawks and a few other teams as well, but just got completely derailed by that. John Lucas is our next guy. Twice in his career, Lucas was banished from the NBA for using drugs. First time was December 1984. The second time was in 1986 offseason. He tested positive for cocaine that offseason. In order to stay in the league, Lucas underwent anti-drug and anti-alcohol treatment. He spent 4 more years in the league before retirement. And then he's one of the good stories because after drug rehab, he returned to the NBA as a coach and started to operate a substance abuse recovery program to help other athletes. And still to this day is doing pretty well from what I coached in the league for many years as well. But seemed to definitely clean himself up after having some really bad run-ins for a while. David Thompson, drugs, alcohol, and cocaine all affect his career immensely. He's a guy who we've mentioned many times throughout this podcast. A guy who was an absolute great scorer, just a dynamic player for the Nuggets. But eventually, by the early 80s, it kind of all started falling apart for him. And in 1982, this was his last year in Denver. He had become drug addicted. He joined drug rehab clinics to reform himself, but all efforts did not really work. The last nail in the coffin was a accident at the famed Studio 54 nightclub when he fell down from the stairs and got a severe knee injury, which forced him out of the league at a pretty young age. So he's a guy that really could have had another long run in the NBA, but just drugs kind of put him down in general. Following his NBA career, Thompson continued a downward spiral with drugs and alcohol. He, though, thankfully became a committed Christian and put his life back in order. He now devotes his time to working with young basketball players and helping them to aspire to his achievements and avoid his mistakes. So another good story as well. Quinn Daly is another one. He missed practices and games. He famously gained 30 pounds in a single season. He twice violated the league's drug policy and once attempted suicide and took leaves of absence. And I forgot, I didn't check in on what Quentin Daly is or how he ended up, but definitely had some bad run-ins there. Micheal Ray Richardson, a guy we talked about on this podcast before, February 1986, he tests positive for cocaine for a third time. He becomes the first player to get banned under the NBA's anti-drug program. He went on to play a few seasons after being banned in the Continental Basketball Association, the United States Basketball League, and then also played in Europe as well. A few more here real quick. John Drew, he was the former Atlanta Hawks guard. He was the first player ever to be banned for life by the NBA's new drug policy. His career came to an end due to a cocaine addiction. During the 83 offseason, during the 83 season, he missed a huge number of games as he underwent an intensive 8-week detox treatment. While he would win the league's Comeback Player of the Year award in 1984, he relapsed in 1985 and was banned from the NBA in 1986 for multiple violations. As of 2002, Drew was living in Houston, Texas, where Charles Barkley had last reported seeing him and had finally had a grip on his cocaine addiction, but he is he's a taxi cab driver in Houston. So you might get John Drew as your taxi cab driver if you go to Houston. Then Marques Johnson's our last one. 9 months after Johnson, Junior Bridgman and Harvey Catchings were traded to the Los Angeles Clippers. This is 1984. The Clippers filed suit in Los Angeles federal court to nullify the trade because the Bucks had not told the Clippers that Johnson had undergone treatment at St. Mary's Drug Rehab Facility in Minneapolis. While he was still with the Bucks, the trade was not nullified. In October 1985, Johnson told the Milwaukee Journal he was treated for cocaine use again. So he kind of confirmed it. There was a question at the time, and Marques sort of went, "Oh, I don't know what that's talking about." And Don Nelson was like, "That's the first I've heard." Like pretty much everybody in Milwaukee was kind of saying, "Oh, no, we have no idea about it." But later they admitted that was an issue. So as you can see, a lot of this stuff did come down in the early 80s, but it was still an issue in the 70s, even though there wasn't as much enforcement as we sort of saw in the 80s when David Stern comes in the league and a few other guys come in the league and go, okay, we need to really get this thing under control, because it was bad in the 70s.
Yeah. By the way, for Quinn Daly, he passed away in 2010.
Okay. I did not know that. Yeah.
I'd forgotten that. There's a story also in during a game against San Antonio in 85. He had a ball boy bring him food during a game, and as the third quarter drew to a close, he was eating a slice of pizza, nachos, popcorn, and a soft drink. So,
that's not bad.
Not great decisions for him. Yeah, it's interesting because the cocaine use goes on, of course, as much of an 80s problem as it is a 70s problem, yet it doesn't really affect the popularity of the league as it starts to increase during that time. But as you mentioned, that's also when people start getting suspended for and the serious punishment starts to happen. And I wonder if there's a correlation between, we don't feel bad investing in this league that we feel has all these drug addicts because they're going after, this law enforcement type thing. I wonder if that probably certainly had an appeal to a certain segment of fans. But yeah, there was talk at certain points that, like 75 or 80% of the guys were using cocaine, which, seems a little bit high. I mean, I can certainly buy that number of guys had used cocaine, but were actively using the drug, in the late 70s. That seems a little bit, hard to swallow, but certainly, I don't think anyone's going to argue that it wasn't an issue during that time. But it's interesting where it's sort of perceived as a thing that's sort of preventing the league from, catching on in popularity in the late 70s, with its effect on play, or just with the scandals turning people off. But at the same time, it's still an issue in the mid 80s. Yet it 2 comeback player of the years in a row, I believe, John Drew and Micheal Richardson end up relapsing, unfortunately.
Right.
So it's interesting how it maybe kind of fits the narrative, but there's some question about that. I don't know, but looking at the finances and how bad finances get, there's stories of teams almost going under. Of course, the bidding war with the ABA had let salaries increase quite a bit, and for the most part, the NBA, instead of using deferred compensation, they didn't have the dog off plan. They did do some deferred compensation, but it was more, we'll get into that a little bit, but it wasn't necessarily like the 20 years down the line like the ABA was using. But salaries had increased dramatically, and franchises with reported financial problems so bad that the league nearly had to step in. At the very least, the Nuggets, Pacers, Nets, Pistons, Cavs, Kings, Jazz, and Clippers all had serious issues where the league had to step in at a certain point, in the late 70s or early 80s. June of 77, so pretty much after the merger. A year after the merger, the NBA owners vote to reduce the rosters from 12 to 11, which the player union sues. But basically, the idea is that's a cost-cutting measure to get at least one fewer players, so they're not having to pay such high salaries. But at the same time, David Thompson in April of 78 signs the richest contract in pro sports, 5 years, $4 million, which this is right before he really gets into the bad situation of cocaine. In 79, where the addiction takes serious hold for him. Bill Walton in May of 79 also signs a 7-year, $5.6 million deal. So this kind of crazy money, especially for Walton, given his injury history, is being thrown around at the same time these teams are dealing with these financial issues, which kind of demonstrates to me like the ownership is not being the smartest here. They're sort of, hoping for things to get better, but aren't really, planning all that well.
Right.
And in December of 79, a group of owners meet to discuss revenue sharing and worries about expansion, which is being talked about, and worries like, hey, we're going to dilute the league if we're not careful. In February of 1980, there's a new CBA signed, which agrees to restore the 12 roster spots by 83 and also limits future deferred payments to 2 years rather than being any further than that. March of 1980, Dallas gets an expansion team. The original plan was 2 expansion teams, so they at least limit that. In April of 1980, Ted Stepien buys the Cavs. We talked about that in our ownership.
And that goes well.
That
goes really well.
Right.
So, because he's great. He's a great man, great owner, just great everything. So
yeah, May of 81, Donald Sterling buys the Clippers, who are still in
also
San
good.
Diego. Yes.
So good old run here. Both guys are just great people and great owners. So yeah, just Everything's looking up for the NBA right now.
June of 81, the NBA forms a committee to consider what steps may be taken to ensure the financial stability of the league. And they report $13 million in losses for the league in the 1980 season. June of 81, also Magic Johnson signed a 25-year, $25 million deal, which I think demonstrates that the rich owners and in good markets can still afford players, but it's, it's kind of a league of rich teams and poor teams very much, where the poor teams, are in danger of folding, and the rich teams, like the Lakers, are doing fine. March of 82, the Players Union threatens a work stoppage after Donald Sterling falls behind in his payments. Later that month, a boycott is averted when Kansas City makes good on some of its deferred payments, including $50,000 to Oscar Robertson, which is kind of amazing, given that Oscar retired in 75. So, and left the Royals in the late 60s. So some of that may have been lawsuit related money from the Oscar Robertson suit, but still, that's in April of 82, it's reported that the league owes $80 to $90 million in deferred money, which is a crazy amount. August of 82, the NBA claims that 18 of 23 teams lost money. And then in October of 82, the owners they come up with a plan seeking major reductions from players, reducing the size of rosters from 12 to 10, eliminating the obligation of regarding player pensions, health, life insurance, and severance pay. 75% of the players' income from their shoe endorsements, requesting that. Downgrading air travel from first class to coach, and elimination of all guaranteed contracts. Now, of course, this is, where the NBA teams are claiming these incredible losses are also during a time in which there are CBA negotiations. And we saw this in, with the 2011 lockout, where the league, a lot of the teams were claiming poverty. And then just a few years later, financially, everything's great. And
right.
Economic situations change. And this is also 82 is also during a major recession as well. So, there may be some posturing, but there may, I think there are teams that are struggling, but whether things are quite as dire as the teams are saying, I think is worth considering a question, but it certainly isn't good that, these things are publicly coming up, and, that there's worries about these things.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I do think that's a little bit of both, but yeah, we have seen it many times used from every sports league, particularly in the NBA, as kind of a bargaining chip as well, of like, hey, look how awful we're doing, and then immediately it's, as you said, like a year later, oh wait, we're doing great now. Sorry, like now buy our franchises for $2 million or $2 billion if you'd like to. Thank you, bye. Like,
yes. So in February of 83, Commissioner Larry O'Brien forms two committees, one to help ailing franchises and one to find ways to strengthen the whole league. And the committee later that month explores possibilities of eliminating up to 5 teams: the Cavs, the Pacers, the Kings, the Clippers, and the Jazz. So those 5 teams are all, there's danger of them being eliminated at that point. In March of 83, Ted Stepien seeks permission to move the Cavs to Toronto. And also that month, players agree to a salary cap and other concessions. Nothing like what they were requesting, but they do. It kind of goes into sort of the modern system of the salary cap and the revenue sharing that kind of the basis of the CBA today. A lot of things have changed, of course, since then, but kind of that basic framework is established in March of 83. In April of 83, the Indiana GM says there's a high probability that the team will either move to Sacramento or fold. And soon afterward, the Cavs are sold to the Gund family and the Pacers are sold to the Simon family, which sort of stabilizes those ownership situations and make those better. So the situation of some really bad owners, holding on to teams to solve at least the problem partially. June of 83, the Kings end up being sold to a Sacramento-based group, and they move a couple seasons later. Also, the NBA expands the playoffs to 16 teams. It begins with the Ted Stepien rule involving not being able to trade draft picks 2 consecutive years in a row. And in September of 83, the NBA and the Players Union agreed to a strict drug policy in which we begin to seeing severe drug suspensions after that. And by 84, things start to begin to turn around as better ownership groups are found. Teams in struggling markets, move. The San Diego ends up moving to to LA as well, which the NBA doesn't like, but that actually seems to help them. Although unfortunately they're stuck with Donald Sterling for another 30 years. Attendance and ratings increase, as we mentioned, and the NBA starts to enter its boom period. So that's kind of, by 84, things there isn't really this kind of talk anymore of we're going to have to fold franchises. These teams are really struggling. There may be a team here and there that has financial issues, but for the most part, the crisis seems to be averted by 84. And of course, the boom is coming right after that.
Yeah, and as far as like kind of digging into a little bit more of like the public perception of the NBA's future and issues with that, it's hard to find a ton of articles or a ton of news clippings, of course, in this time that are really big and dire on the NBA's future. But there is one that the New York Post, we couldn't find it, but the New York Post at least posted that O'Brien, who's obviously the NBA commissioner, denies NBA is kaput. So that was the headline there. We couldn't find the actual article, but that would have been interesting to read. But there was a really interesting one in the February 26, 1979 Sports Illustrated that's called There's an Ill Wind Blowing for the NBA. And this is really descriptive about a lot of the issues going on in the NBA, a lot of the issues going on, just what the league's going to do in the next decade, a bunch of stuff. But one of the quotes, attendance is slipping and the league's TV ratings have plummeted, leading to a lot of cries and whispers about the real problems. So there's a bunch of really good quotes in there too. And it also, this article, which I definitely, or this article, I guess you could say, I would will people to go check it out because it's definitely interesting. Denver General Manager Carl Scheer believes that the NBA doomsday talk would be academic were it not for the unimaginative and inept management in New York. So that's interleague stuff that's not going on too well, and it is agreed that today's players are better than ever. So this is a quote from that actual article as well, as kind of trying to figure out what one of the issues is. It is agreed that today's players are better than ever. They're so good, in fact, that many believe they're too good for the game. When the NBA began in 1946, no team made more than 30% of its shots. Today, two teams are shooting better than 51%. The NBA record and the league-wide percentage is 48.4%.
Yeah,
so
I know. I don't understand how more missed shots would be better for.
I don't either. I'm trying to figure that out too. Like, I was better when.
Yeah, I guess
scoring was it. Like, I don't know. I don't agree with that, but okay.
Yeah,
like,
I guess there is. Yeah, scoring loses a certain amount of value at a certain point if it's too easy to make shots. I guess if it's just kind of.
I guess that's forth. It was like no one's playing defense anymore. They're just. But yeah, I don't. Yeah, I mean, I guess. Not too far from what we're going on today. So it's weird how this is cyclical. The article also dances around a lot of it. And I guess I shouldn't say dances around. It really kind of meets it head on about the racial ramifications for league-wide popularity. And it addresses that there were a lot of concerns between, nobody is quoted exactly as saying, but there's a lot of idea that, rich African-Americans are kind of negative to a white fan base. White fan bases don't want to just watch a bunch of, rich African-Americans play this game. And it was obviously a predominantly black game in the 70s. And most of the stars were black and all that sort of stuff. So there's issues of that too, and they're wondering if maybe that is one of the things that's causing it. But it's a little bit of this doom and gloom talk, but it's not necessarily. There's not a ton of like you kind of brought up a few things, but again, we don't quite get that same idea of like, oh my God, here's what's going on. They have a year left to go, or like that. It's just always kind of this idea that, well, is this league viable for the next decade, or is this league going to hang around, or whatever. So it never anything addressed directly, but at least some different issues brought up and questions asked. So definitely check that out. There's an ill wind blowing for the NBA. It's in the February 26, 1979 Sports Illustrated. Get some nice insights into what was going on at the time.
Yeah, and it also mentions the Knicks late 70s struggle, where the kind of the early part of the decade where the league started to at least gain national coverage, if not necessarily more popularity. The Knicks were obviously one of the strong teams of the early part of the decade, and once they started to decline, once Chamberlain, West, Baylor, Oscar Robertson, the stars of the 60s into the 70s, that next generation of players may have had a little bit of a difficult time connecting with audiences. Even Dr. J, we talked about looking at the TV ratings and things, like there wasn't necessarily a huge boost in him bringing attendance, and they really 77, they actually changed the schedule so that each team, they had a balanced schedule of each team playing each other 4 times throughout the entire league, where part of that was the anticipation that Irving would, bring in so much, popularity, bring in such crowds that everyone would benefit. And attendance did go up that year before it went down the next year, but he didn't, for whatever reason, the he obviously was a huge star and one of the best players in the league and all that, but he didn't really bring that level of transcendent change that was kind of more ushered in by Bird and Magic. Even though he certainly held things up and was a great star, but he for whatever reason didn't seem to inspire that great turnaround, despite being linked with in a big market with a popular team.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned a little bit there, which is addressed in this article as well, there's a paragraph talking about the major media markets and how their attendance was all kind of down at the same time, which might have just been a confluence of a lot of things happening at once. But here's a quote from the article. It says, however, the most alarming news is that attendance in the big four markets of New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Philadelphia is down drastically. The Knicks are down 11%. The Bulls 31% are once strong teams that have become woefully weak. The 76ers and the Lakers, who are both bona fide championship contenders, are down 19% for the 76ers and 11% for the Lakers. And there's a quote from Jerry West, who was the Lakers coach at the time, says, people I talk to around Los Angeles all the time tell me that there isn't a great deal of interest in either the Lakers or the NBA. So it could have just been a weird confluence of a lot of the major media markets just kind of being out, or it's interesting to say, but it's just it all kind of came to a head in one little time period there where you had, because one of the article before that talks about, some of these league-wide attendance is doing kind of okay because there's some markets that aren't the biggest but are doing really well. Like the Detroit Pistons started doing really well. The San Diego Clippers in their move from Buffalo did pretty well their first year. The Supersonics did well. San Antonio. So there were these little, and I guess it gets into discussions we've had about the parity of the 70s as well, is that a lot of these little small markets or little teams or whatever, or newer teams are doing well, but a lot of the big time teams, your Chicago's, your to an extent the Knicks, after their little period in the early 70s kind of struggled afterwards, and that could be an issue with how the media perceives it, because a lot of the media markets are New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, that sort of stuff, and their teams aren't doing well and their attendance isn't doing well. So that could play into the narrative that the NBA is struggling, when in large part San Antonio it's doing great and Detroit it's doing well. So that's an interesting aspect of it as well.
Yeah, and there's also the aspect of they've just moved into basketball has come to a bunch of cities within the last 5 or 10 years that had never had it before or had never really been successful. Just the time to build that goodwill. I mean, none of the initial NBA teams, particularly did strong business, for 10 years until the NBA was established or so. So it just is, part of it, I think, is just it takes time to build these things, and it takes time for the benefits of expansion to take hold as you gain a foothold in your community and you become a thing that people want to do. I mean, I'm sure there's a wait and see for a lot of these teams, especially given how fast teams moved around in the the late 60s and early 70s, for a wait and see for a lot of these places, where eventually once the team has some success and has some identity and puts down some roots, there's more of a chance for crowds to come to those things. So it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg kind of thing too. The team needs the fan support, but the team needs to have a certain amount of cachet within the community before it can get that, whether through winning or just whether through being there and feeling like they're a civic institution. Anything else?
No, I think that's about it. So I don't know. Did we solve that mystery? I feel like it didn't get as bad as people say, but I guess it wasn't great. But I don't know. I'm kind of in between. I don't know if we've solved this one, but yeah, I don't know if it's quite as awful as people sort of perceive it. But I think it helps the narrative then that Magic and Bird came, and then there were the shining light, and everything was great after that. But I don't know. There's definitely some truth to the fact that it was struggling. But yeah, I don't know if it was quite as awful as people perceive.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some nuance to it. I would have to say, there's truth to the myth, but I'm not sure the myth is actually true. Thanks for checking us out. You can find us at the Step Back at fansided.com. We also have other great podcasts that are part of the Step Back network, including Fast Baked Breakfast, Nothing But Nylon, and The Replay with L and Al. So check those out if you get a chance. You can subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcast. Just search for Over and Back or The Step Back. And you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Over and Back NBA. So thanks for listening. We'll be back again soon.